Today, Ibram Savy, will take you into a story full of mystery. A story about a person whose whole life was full of immorality until doom came to him. The beginning of this story began when one of my neighbors died. I don't want to mention his name. Let's just call him Mr. Booty. Mr. Booty was known as a bad person. He loved to gamble and drink alcohol. I even heard that he liked to go to brothels. His bad behavior was supported by his wealth. He obtained so much wealth from bad deeds, namely by lending money at high interest rates. Whether you want to call him a loan shark, or whatever, it's up to you. When he died, none of the residents wanted to come to his house. But when they saw his wife crying for help and one of the Qi suggested helping fellow Muslims, although I'm not sure Mr. Booty was a Muslim because I've never seen him pray, finally the neighbors were willing to help. My father asked me, who was still a teenager, to come along. A commotion occurred when they wanted to wrap Mr. Booty's body. The shroud that was supposed to wrap Mr. Booty's body was unable to cover his entire fat body. Finally they bought a wider shroud, but it still didn't fit. After 3 times it still didn't fit. At that time my nose could smell the stench of Mr. Booty's body. Finally one of the mourners suggested changing the white shroud to a black one. I don't know where that crazy idea came from, but it worked. Mr. Booty's body could be wrapped in the black shroud very easily, as if it was a shroud that fit him perfectly. While all the mourners were busy with the beer that had not yet arrived, especially since it was raining heavily, I was still standing in front of Mr. Booty's body, which was lying stiff on the bed. At that time, suddenly and slowly, Mr. Booty's body moved and sat up. He turned stiffly towards me with wide eyes, then said something with his stiff lips. Wearing black, who's afraid? Isn't it funny? Ha. 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 Actually, the story is not like that. When I saw Mr. Booty's stiff body, for some reason the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. It was the first time in my life that I had seen a body wrapped in a black shroud. Maybe this was the first time in history that a corpse was wrapped in black. After the coffin arrived, the mourners immediately took Mr. Booty's body to the nearest prayer room for prayers. I didn't join them because it was raining heavily. It was better to sleep in this cold temperature. When I arrived home, everyone was gone because they had all gone to the funeral home to help. I, who was starting to get goosebumps again, whether because of the cold rain or something else, finally decided to go to the grave with my father. Luckily, when I returned to the prayer room, the procession of mourners was already preparing to leave. I saw in front, the coffin carrying Mr. Booty's body was being lifted by 10 people who looked like they were trying very hard to walk, as if they were lifting a very heavy load. On the way, many of those carrying the coffin asked for help from other mourners to replace them. Arriving at the cemetery, something surprising happened. Mr. Booty's grave was not ready. According to the 5 grave diggers, they had difficulty digging because of the hard texture of the soil, even though it was raining at that time. 6 hoes had been used and 3 different locations had been dug, but they could only dig to a depth of half a meter. Finally, the Qi who led the group asked everyone to pray for a while. After that he ordered them to dig again. Not long after, a grave hole was ready, although not very deep, but enough to bury the body. Another problem arose when no one wanted to go into the grave to catch Mr. Booty's body. And the rain that had been falling since earlier began to pour heavily, along with the sound of thunder that was getting louder. Finally they planned to put him in with a rope. But before that could be done, Mr. Booty's body, which was at the edge of the grave, suddenly went in by itself due to an earthquake that only lasted for a moment. A loud sound followed shortly after Mr. Booty's body fell. Finally, the mourners without another word immediately buried Mr. Booty's body. After that, The Kyai led the last prayer before the mourners returned to their respective homes. Not even a week had passed since Mr. Booty's death, but bad news had already spread. My neighbors told me that they were visited by Mr. Booty's ghost with his black shroud and with a very scary face. My house also became one of the victims of Mr. Booty's ghost, but luckily I didn't see it, only my parents were disturbed by it. Only after the news spread, Mr. Booty's family advised me not to tell anyone about Mr. Booty's ghost. Finally, Mr. Booty's ghost never appeared again. A month later, I went out of town to visit my friend. I told him about Mr. Booty. The reason I told my friend at that time was because Mr. Booty's ghost had not appeared for a month, and this was out of town. Moreover, my friend did not know Mr. Booty. But I was wrong. After I went home, a day later my friend called me. He said he was visited by a ghost whose characteristics were exactly the same as what I described. In his story, he even peed his pants. I, who was not easily convinced, went to my other friend's house the next day, whose house was further away. I told her everything about the ghost of Mr. Booty, my neighbor. And after I got home, the next day my friend called and told me the same thing as what my first friend had experienced. I, who was starting to half believe, immediately tested it again with my female friend who lived abroad. I told her via email. After 4 days of not getting an answer or any news, I was relieved, because I thought that my 2 friends who called me were just having a horror dream because of my story. But on the 5th day, an email came from my female friend. In her email she said that she was visited by a ghost wearing a black shroud and with a scary face. According to her, it was the scariest ghost she had ever seen. And if you have read this story, please don't say that I told it or wrote it, because I am also afraid of meeting the ghost in the black shroud. And if you are visited by the ghost of Mr. Booty tonight, just convey my regards to him. And happy haunted. If you have a story, write it below the comment column. Thank you.